Sorry. Is it okay?
Oh, no, we have to go back again. So
Yeah, but you can.
yes,
We don't need to start from the beginning.
No problem, Ambassador. We will. Let me rephrase the question again. Welcome, Ambassador Moeller, to the National Critics' Choice and the Policymaker Online News. Could you tell us about the trends right now that's happening, with Asia and the Western world? Because since the release of your book last year, many policymakers and institutions right now have adopted your material, and somehow, one way or another, even Kishore Mahbubani, argued that the rise of Asia has actually, in more than one ways, has created a resentment, towards the Asians' attitude. But tell us, in your own opinion, what's happening right now with the way business is being performed, and how policymakers are now taking steps to adopt Asia as part of the paradigm.
Well, Asia is changing very fast to mass communication. Asia is also starting to change to the era of scarcities. If you look at mass communication first, the fact that productivity is going up if you share your knowledge with other persons means that you will have to work more in groups and communities, which means that we move away from the individual to groups, communities working together. This is happening in Asia with Asia's old culture and philosophies. The era of scarcities, there you're also forced to work in groups and communities. Actually, the world faces 5 scarcities: a food shortage, commodities, energy, water, clean environment, which means that compared to the preceding 200 years, we move from distribution of benefits to burden sharing. Burden sharing, you're only ready to go into burden sharing if you live in groups and work in communities, so that you expect other people to share the burden in an equal, fair, equitable way. So it means that the 2 main drivers of the new economy and the new society, namely mass communication and scarcities, they both focus on the same, namely groups, communities working together, replacing individualism. If you recall what Adam Smith, the famous economist, said more than 200 years ago, namely that the wealth of a society is the accumulation of individual wealth. That means that you focus upon the individual. So the individual is supposed to build wealth. But if you see in the future, individual wealth may not necessarily be accumulated into society's wealth, because we can see that there are many aberrations, abuses, wrong things, inequality. So you need to shape a more equitable society based upon the groups. So the focus upon mass communication and scarcity both points towards groups working together. And this is where Asia will take the lead, according to my philosophy, because the Western capitalism, the Western societies, they are based upon the individual pursuing his or her fortune. But if you look upon the Asian societies, going back to the old Asian religion philosophies, there you have a lot of focus upon that you live together, you live in harmony with nature. God is found in a tree, in a river, which means that you will actually have to behave more in conformity with what nature asks of you, instead of exploiting or abusing nature, which is in the Western economic philosophy. When I say this, many people retort that you may not actually see what is happening in Asia, because Asia is consumerism, actually more than the United States or Europe. My answer to that is yes, that is correct. But this is because for the last 20, 30 years, Asia has caught up with the West. Because of that, Asia has adopted the Western values, the Western economic model. But now when we can see that the Western economic model does not any longer deliver, we have seen the financial crisis, we've seen what is called the Great Contraction or the global recession. It's absolutely clear to everybody that the Western economic model does not any longer deliver. When that is the case, Asia has to look elsewhere. And elsewhere for Asia could be to revive its old established religions, philosophies, which actually means that you focus more upon groups working together, sharing, making a more equitable society.
What's going to happen with the economic crisis and the changes that is going to take place here in the early 21st century right now? Because right now many observers have seen that they're skeptical about the way the economics and the way the United Nations and the G20 react in the previous months. Will there be a transformation among policymakers in Asia that would demand the West to conform with the Asian values? And will Asia create its own value system in such a way? Would there be, in your observation, would there be a rise of a Asian currency that would be equivalent to the euro currency?
I think that the first Asia has to, let us call it, de-link somewhat from the Western values. And that, to my mind, is happening. After that, Asia will start to establish its own values. If you, for example, look at the corporate governance is right now an American conception, but in the future it'll be more and more Asian. If you look at what is coming out of China, where you see companies more and more and more as a part of society, not only having to generate profit, but also to contribute to the development of society. That will gradually change the idea of business. In the Western philosophy, in particular the American philosophy, the idea of business is to make profit. In the traditional Asian philosophy, which is now striking roots again in China, it is to be a part of society, to contributing to society, to deliver goods and services which are of benefit to society. That will gradually mean that we will see an Asian model emerge. And that Asian model will also mean that the economic power will transit from the United States to Asia. When that has happened, you will see an Asian currency as the international reserve currency instead of the dollar. But we are here talking about 20, 30 years, a longer time span than people normally think.
Could you share with us the present trends right now? The way economics is going. Some argued that because Chinese, have adopted, capitalism, apart from their usual being a communist state, many have resent the Chinese because the Chinese still believe that it's one man for himself survival mode. Is it that true that if the Chinese, were to adopt capitalism, wouldn't they be more resilient and towards the Western profile?
I think the Chinese will build their own model. They are doing that with their political system, and they will, to my mind, also do it with regard to the economic model, for the very clear reason that the Western economic model, let's call it the American style capitalism, does not any longer respond to challenge. The challenge nowadays is about the environment, pollution, global warming, qualitative growth, sustainable energy, scarce resources, and the American style capitalism has no answers to these problems. They still drive in the growth philosophy, distribution philosophy, which were linked to the industrial society where there was enough of everything. But now when we are going to see the scarcity, you need a new way of thinking, a new conceptual way of thinking. And I don't think that that will come out of the Western model. I think it's likely that it will come out of the Asian model.
What's happening between India relationship with China, and also in between their neighboring neighbors, such as Pakistan, and even Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, and aren't they cooperating each other? And do you think that the rise of India will serve as a complement to China?
Asia will depend on whether China and India can find out how to cooperate. And I think again that that is likely. If China and India start to see each other as rivals, striving to get some kind of hegemony in the Asian area of the world, things will start to go wrong. So economic integration, which is an instrument for distributing growth and wealth in Asia, will be made by China and India working together, and we may include Japan in that equation also. And there's no guarantee that that will happen, but to my mind both the Chinese and the Indian political leaders will realize that they have no alternative, because if they don't do it, they will see lower economic growth. Lower economic growth means higher social instability, and higher social instability also means a growing political instability, which will threaten the political system in both countries. So they will be driven to cooperating with each other by sheer necessity.
Is Asia, and perhaps right now we all know that the West is taking steps to react to climate change and the explosion of the population growth, because there's a lot of scarcity, as you have mentioned earlier, in terms of food security, in terms of power, oil, and other forms of natural resources. Does China and India recognize this? And is Asia alone has the ability to counteract these changes of scarcity of such resources? Or do you think that they will take steps to cooperate with the West and perhaps even the entire world, to ensure that there is enough resources and fair distribution?
China is starting to realize it. More than 1 year ago, Prime Minister Wen Xiaobao said that economic growth was not an end in itself. We needed to have sustainable, qualitative economic growth. And he actually repeated the message a couple of weeks ago before the recent meeting in the People's Congress. So I'm sure that China realizes it, and China is starting to implement measures to that effect. It may take a little longer for India, because India is actually behind China on the curve of economic development. Income per capita is lower in India than in China. China has industrialized, is becoming the manufacturing place in the world. India is not yet there, so it will take longer time for India. And I'm sure that Asia will be the first place where you will really see this strike roots. But of course it needs to be a global effort. And that's where you will move into some kind of global burden sharing, somebody to lead the way. I think that the United States and also Europe, they're economically too weak to do it now. So we will have for Asia to awoke, so to speak, to that new challenge and step up to bat, so to speak. It will take some years, but it will come.
Speaking about Asia itself, does or probably the policymakers in Asia, are they prepared to counteract corruption? This is probably one of the key issues which the West has in mind in this developed world. Corruption is rampant. We all know that. It is happening in almost every part of Asia. Perhaps it will not happen in Singapore, but in this case. But what is your observation in China, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and other parts of Asia? Are they willing, in your own view, are they willing to combat corruption in order for Asia to rise and be a corrupt-free world once again?
Well, very few countries are actually corrupt-free. If you look at the international statistics, you may say that maybe 5 or 10 countries are in that category. But even if you look at Europe, even if you look at the United States, there's also an element of corruption. So it's very difficult to eradicate it completely. But Asia, or at least most of the Asian countries, have taken the first step, and that is that to actually recognize that there's a problem that needs to be addressed. But it will certainly take a very, very long time, because corruption is ingrained in the way most Asian societies function today, and you cannot just with a snap of your fingers change that. So it will take a long time, because before we see corruption out of the picture in Asia, unfortunately so.
What is the Asians' attitude towards oil and gas right now? Because
What is it?
The Asians' attitude, the policymakers' attitude towards oil and gas supply, because as I go back again, they, with the growing demand and scarcity, oil and gas and even other forms of resources are becoming a very important commodity. How does that going to change for the face of Asia? Is the Chinese working very aggressively to obtain such resources in the Middle East, or are they, in preference, have a joint cooperation with the West and Europe, such as Shell and BP? Could you give us some insight on that issue?
I think that the main problem is actually coal, because China and India are sitting on some of the biggest coal reserves in the world. I think China is number 2 and India is number 4. The biggest coal reserve, as far as I know, is in the US, and Russia is, as far as I know, number 3. So the temptation for China and India to use coal, which is a domestic source, will be very, very strong. With regard to oil and gas, I think that they will diverge very strongly. China gets around 45% or something like that of its oil import from the Middle East, but they diversify. The second biggest supplier of oil to China is actually an African country, Angola. So there's no doubt that China and also India, they see the risk of being dependent on the Middle East, and they try to diminish that dependence, but it is of course very, very difficult. If you, for example, try to switch to renewable energy, wind power, solar power, and also if you try to switch to nuclear power, it will take a long time and it will require very high investments. And if you really want to change the composition of energy sources, it's a very, very long process. It takes a lot of time. So I think that China and India will still be dependent on oil and gas, and that will of course be an important parameter in their foreign policy.
What is the Asian views about human rights? And are they prepared to engage human rights, in a way the West has engaged? we look at the issues with what's happening right now in Myanmar, there's been changes that's going on. We'll have seen the way Malaysia reacts right now, Indonesia, and perhaps even Timor-Leste, they're undergoing certain revolution changes to the constituency and the constitution as well. Do you think even a country like Singapore, are they able to adopt these changes in the era of human rights? Is human rights able to be adopted by Asians?
Well, when you speak about human rights, you need to be more clear about what you actually mean. If you ask in Asia whether the population, especially the young people, wants fundamental rights of freedom, the answer will be unquestionably, yes, certainly we do. If you ask the next question, do you associate fundamental rights of freedom with a specific political system? The answer is no. As far as I can see, most Asians do not believe that democracy, which is a special way of selecting political leaders, is an unconditional condition for getting to fundamental rights of freedom. So when the West speaks about human rights and democracy, they mostly speak about democracy as a selection method for political leaders. But this is not how most Asians see it. Most Asians, they actually focus upon fundamental rights of freedom. And they want that, and they, at least for the time being, think that that can be achieved with a different political system from the one we have in the West. So the answer to it is, yes, certainly Asia will move towards more fundamental rights of freedom. But that does not necessarily mean that Asia will move towards the same political system as we have in the West.
How can the West able to engage Asia with such cultural diversity? Asia has many cultures on its own, just as much as Europe and the United States is. The diversity is such that Asia, I think, is in many of the observers' view, as a reluctant society that doesn't want to change. You know, it is a society that wants to have its own political agendas in their own view. What do you think? How does the European society or the Western society are able to engage Asia this way?
Well, I think you have first of all to be clear about we are now passing out of the era of industrialization, which was with us for 200 years. And it produced a political system, liberal democracy, and an economic model, the market economy, which was tailor-made to industrialization. Now we move into another era of mankind where focus is not upon industrialization. And that means that both for the West and for Asia, we will move towards some kind of new political system and some kind of new economic model. Liberal democracy, the political system which you see in the West, was born because it responded to industrialization. The free market system was born because it responded to industrialization. Now when we see another era emerging, both the political system and the economic model will change. No one really knows how and when it will happen. If you go back 250 years, you could not predict that after industrialization we would get liberal democracy and the free market. How could you do that? It was simply not possible. The same we have today. If you ask in 50 years' time what will be the dominating political system, what will be the dominating economic model, you don't know. You will have to probe. And this is in fact what I try to do in my book. I try to probe. I try to bring out some of the challenges, some of the questions, and I also forward a little bit some of the answers. But this is the first step on a long run. So the initial steps is to be clear about that there's this tremendous change, a similar change in the situation of mankind that will lead to another political system, another economic model. And in that respect, I don't think it makes much sense to speak about Asia versus the West and Western values and all these kinds of things, because we will probably not see that in 50 years.
Defense. We saw China now has already produced the first aircraft carrier. And pretty soon we may see something from India, and perhaps, and now that Asia, may see building more nuclear reactor plants and so forth. Even Singapore now is studying the feasibility of having a nuclear plant in collaboration among its partners in Southeast Asia. And to the West, even the IEA and other agencies, they're feeling a threat somehow, because now that Asia has the capability in terms of financial strength to able to develop such energy and defense. In your own view, how does this change the perception of in the area of defense in the West? Will the U.S. And Europe impose certain sanctions on countries in Asia to able to adopt and build up its capability, the same capability and strength the West has? And will the West continue to welcome such change?
Well, there's certainly a risk that some people in the West, in particular the US, will say that the time has come to stop the rise of Asia, in particular the rise of China. But I don't think that they will prevail. If you try to do that, and if you try to prevent the Asian countries from building military capabilities, new technologies, use their economic strengths, I mean, you move towards a world of confrontation, crisis, conflicts. And I don't think that there will be a stomach for doing so, not even in the United States. It'll be too risky, it'll be too dangerous, it'll be too costly. So I think that hopefully that the era of globalization also means that the West, the United States, recognize that it will have to share some of its powers with new countries emerging out of Asia.
Does the United States, the UN, and even the International Nuclear Energy Agency able to recognize Singapore as a country able to adopt and build up its nuclear power among its partners in Southeast Asia? There's been a lot of talk on this issue, and because Southeast Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia are now perhaps even Thailand are in talks in trying to build a nuclear power distribution, because it is deemed as more efficient, cleaner, and yet others may flip to the other side of a coin, saying that with nuclear power you could develop other forms of defense. What are your views on this?
Well, I've not looked into that question, so I'm not an expert on it. But I would say that if the countries you mentioned follow international rules with the International Energy Agency and the other international agencies, I don't think that there should be a problem.
What's happening to Africa right now? Because as you have mentioned in your book, the rise of Asia, and Europe been having some sense of resentment, However, China is taking a very active role, and also as well as India and Singapore is taking on a very active role in playing a major part in Africa, or the African continent economy. Will the buyout of Africa's resources continue, such as sugar, oil, rice, and agriculture, and perhaps even oil and other mining resources? um, would there be enough, or how much is enough for China?
Well, I think China wants to secure its supply of commodities and raw materials, energy, and that is what you have seen is the case for great powers, superpowers. They have always been trying to do so. The British did so, the Americans did so. China will probably also do so, and China will work out its own economic relationship with the African countries, Latin American countries, also Australia. So they will look for the raw materials. I mean, it's nothing new in that. The new is that China is doing it. It used to be the US and Europe. But the fact that the most powerful economic nation is doing it is actually nothing new. So I wouldn't see that as a real new thing.
If you're an investor in today's world, what would be the top three advice that you would give to any policymaker or investors? You know, the kind of instruments they should be looking out for and invest.
First, I would say that we have come to the era of scarcities, which means that there will be a shortage of food, commodities, water, etc., which means that you will have to change production and consumption. Second, I would say that this leads us to burden sharing instead of distribution of benefits, and you will have to do that domestically, and you will have to do that internationally, even globally. And certainly, the only way the world can survive is that we move towards some kind of global governance, stronger international commitments, stronger international understanding, and that will have to be done very fast.
But is there anything that you could share insights with policymakers or probably even investors? Are there any form of resources that they should look out for to invest, to in terms of more job creation and wealth?
I think that you would have to what was the question?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, but you